this video, we're going to look at how to get user input and save that user input and then do stuff with that user input. So I've resetted my player controller script back to its default state. I just deleted all the extra code we typed in for the last couple of tutorials. In Unity, if you go to Edit and Project Settings, you have an option there called Input. So Unity has this Input Manager set up for us that allows us to check whether the user is typing in certain buttons or moving the mouse in a certain direction or using a joystick or anything like that. So here, as you can see, the Input Manager is set up into axes, and those are called horizontal, vertical, fire 1, fire 2, etc. We'll get to that later, but to access all the input functions in Unity, you'll use the input keyword, right? So usually, if you're checking for input, you're going to be doing it inside your update area. And if I want to check for an input, I'm going to use an if statement. If you're not sure what if statements are, go back and watch the last video. So I'm going to use an if statement, and in the condition, I'm going to put in, there's 3 different ways we can check user input. The first is called the GetKey method. So you'll type in input like that, and then you put a full stop, and we'll type in GetKey, followed by parentheses. So all this does is it's a function that's part of an input class that's inside the Unity Engine namespace, and essentially tells us if a user is pressing a button on the keyboard. We have to pass this function some information so that it knows what button to look for. And the information we have to pass it is what's called the key code for the certain key you're looking for. So we're going to use another helpful built-in part of Unity called the key code, and you're just going to write key code dot and then whatever key you're looking for. So if I want to check if I'm pressing space, I'll type in key code dot space like that. So the key code for the space button gets passed to this input.getKey, and if I press space, this is going to return either true or false. And if it's true, it's going to run whatever code I type in here. If it's false, then it'll just skip it, right? So I'm just going to, for now, print to the console, you have typed in the space. Oh, whoop, not typed in. You have pressed the space key. Just like that. I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back to my Unity code, and I'm going to run that game, but I'm going to go to the console first. So press play. Nothing happens when I type any of the keys, but now I'm going to press space, and it tells me I've pressed the space key. I'll press it again and again and again, and it keeps doing it. Now, this input.getKey has 2 other similar functions. There's one called input.getKey down, which will return true only for the first frame that the key is pressed down. And then there's input.getKey up, which will return true only when the key gets released, the first frame that the key gets released. So if you're doing something like shooting a bullet and you only want it to occur once every time you press a button, you'd usually use input.getKey down. And if you're trying to do something continuous, so moving, for example, then you'd usually use, if you're doing it this way, you'd usually use input.getKey by itself, because that registers true for the whole time that the keyboard's down, every single frame. So that's Input.GetKey. Another one that you'll use is Input.GetButton, like that, right? And what Input.GetButton does is, instead of looking for each keyboard key manually, right, it's actually logged to one of those input axes in Unity. So if I go back to Unity and I'll go back to Edit, Project Settings and Input, right here it has a Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, etc. Right? So if I wanted this to, actually let's leave it as Fire 1, it tells you that the positive button is left control. So all of these axes have a positive, a alternative positive, and a negative. For now, just look for the positive buttons. So left control is stored under this Fire 1 name, right? It's kind of like a variable. And what this allows us to do is, later in the game, it will allow the user to map their own buttons from their keyboards. So they can say, instead of left control to become Fire 1, I want, I don't know, the H key to become a Fire 1. And it's easy for you to allow them to do that in the settings. You can still do that with GetKey, but it becomes all hacky and long and annoying. So because this is called Fire 1, I have to pass that to this Input.GetButton. So I'm going to type in Fire 1 as a string, and just as a reminder, a string is just a whole bunch of characters inside quotation marks. So it's stored there in Fire 1, and I'm just going to print, you have shot a bullet for now. You have shot a bullet. Like that, and I'll save it. I'll wait a little bit for it to compile. So now, because I got rid of the old code, when I press space, nothing happens. But I'm going to press my left control key, and it tells me, you have shot a bullet. And similar to the GetKey example, there's also a get button down and a get button up. So I'm going to use get button down for anything to do with firing a bullet or anything like that. And for movement, you could use get button by itself, but it's usually going to be the next one we're going to talk about, which is GetAxis. So I'll stop that and play it again. So if I press Control, so now it only does it once every time I press the left control button. Cool. Okay, and then the last one you need to know is Input.GetAxis. No. Oh yeah, I got that right. Input.GetAxis, and this time you have to pass it one of the axes on your game. So in Unity, I'll go back to it. You have a x-axis, which is your, actually we'll leave that for 3D. In 2D, just know that there's a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. Right, so on your horizontal axis, that's going left to right, vertical is going up and down. So here it tells us that the negative button, or what's called the negative button, is the left arrow. What's called the positive button is the right arrow. And then you can also use A and D, which is similar to most games. So what GetAxis does is, instead of returning true or false, it actually returns a number. So if you press the left button, or whatever the negative button is, it's going to return -1. And if you press the positive button, it's going to return +1. Right? So it returns two different values. And in your script, after you put Input.GetAxis, you have to tell it which axis you want. So here, this one's called horizontal, spelt like that. So I have to type horizontal exactly how it's spelt. So input.getAxis horizontal. But remember, in an if statement, in the condition, so in this part, I have to put something that evaluates to either true or false, right? And I just said that the GetAxis will return 1 or -1. So to change that, I have to check if it's going to return 1 or -1. And I can do it like that. So if it's greater than 1, that means that, sorry, if it's greater than 0, that means that it's going to be 1, which means I've pressed the right arrow, right? And then I can use an else if statement like that. So input.getAxis is less than 0, which means it's -1. So if it's greater than 0, that means it's 1, which means I've pressed the right arrow key. If it's less than 0, that means it's -1, which means I've pressed the left arrow key. So up here, I'm going to say you are moving right. And down here, I'm just going to copy that. And I'm going to say you are moving left. Just like that. And for actual player movement, you'll usually use this GetAxis. And I'll press play again. Right. So if I press any of the keys, nothing's happening. If I press my left arrow key, it's saying I'm moving left. If I press my right key, it's saying I'm moving right. And then remember there were alternative keys. So for the left arrow key, the alternative is A. So if I press A, it tells me I'm moving left. And if I press D, which is the alternative for the right arrow key, it'll tell me I'm moving right. Right? So that's how you get user input. And in the next video, or the next couple of videos, we'll actually get our player moving left and right and jumping.